7, and welcome to episode 2 on how do rockets work. In today's video, we're going to talk about engine cycles and how rocket engines operate. Before we get into the video, just 2 rules that we need to keep in mind. Pressure always flows from high to low, and also we need to keep in mind this new concept, which is called enthalpy. Enthalpy is, it's the sum of all the energy inside of the system. So in our case, the sum of all the energy in this system or in all the systems on their own. And what enthalpy means is, it's the potential to do work. So the higher the enthalpy, the higher potential work that this system can do. So we can raise enthalpy in a couple ways. We can increase the energy. So this would mean using more energetic compounds for fuel. We could increase the pressure, and this would be the pressure inside the combustion chamber. Or we can increase the volume, so a bigger engine, right? A bigger engine can do more work, that makes sense. Higher powered propellants does more work, which also, logically checks out. And so does the pressure, right? Higher pressure means the more stuff you can throw out quicker. Now, let's get started with the video because this one's gonna be a little bit. The first engine that we have is what's called a cold gas thruster. And the way this works is very simple. It's the simplest type of engine we can have, other than, like a solid rocket booster. The way this works is you have some propellant at a very high pressure inside of a tank, and you have a valve, and you have a nozzle, right? This is if you remember our last video, this is called a dual valve nozzle, and this basically takes in high pressure, converges it, and then expands it, turns it into low pressure, high velocity, right? So let's just let some of this pressure in through by opening a valve, right? We open the valve and the fluid comes through this pipe, gets converged, and then comes out through the exhaust. And your cold gas thruster is on. Now, although this system is the simplest, as it is the simplest, it has drawbacks, right? How do we get more thrust out of it? Well, we would want to increase the pressure, right? Or the volume. So we'll say, okay, let's just make the pressure bigger, and because we need to make pressure bigger, we now need to have bigger tanks, right? Bigger tanks can store more. We need to have thicker tank walls, right? Because the thicker the tank, the more pressure you can store, right? Because pressure always goes from high to low. So we want higher pressures because that'll increase enthalpy and will increase the thrust that we can produce. Eventually though, because you're making thicker and thicker tank walls, you're also increasing the weight, so the thrust to weight ratio. The thrust to weight ratio of the rocket will slowly decrease, and by slowly, I mean very quickly. Every time you want to increase pressure, you need a thicker tank wall. Thicker tank wall increases the weight of the rocket, and increasing the weight means that you need more thrust to push it, so it just becomes a kind of a negative feedback loop. And eventually there's a limit where by increasing this to add more pressure, you're not gaining anything. Actually, you'll be losing more things. However, because they're so simple, there's a good amount of uses for these. These are mainly used for maneuvering rockets. So if you've ever seen the Falcon 9 boosters land, they have the little nitrogen thrusters, right? Those little pods that are on the side of the rocket. Those pods are just a set of cold gas thrusters, and it allows it to push out gas wherever it needs to turn. So these are used in a lot of the times maneuvering, and they're quite simple. You only have one moving part, which is a valve. It's quite reliable. Now, moving on to our second type of engine, we have a monoprop pressure engine. Monoprop just means that it's one propellant and pressure fed because it has this tank here feeding pressure into the system so that it pushes. This is a high pressure tank, right? So we'll just draw an extra wall just to make it, look more like a high pressure tank. Let's just pretend this wall is filled. I don't want to fill it all the way in. Okay. The way this engine works is by opening a valve once this valve is open, this high pressure pressurant tank can come in and it can fill up this tube, and then it'll also fill up this tank. But because this tank already has our propellant, in most cases it's hydrazine, right? It already has our propellant inside of it. The propellant is pushed into this tube, right? And in here, in the combustion chamber, it reacts with a catalyst. Normally, because we're using hydrazine, we'll use iridium infused aluminum bed, and this produces hot gas that flows through here because there's higher pressure here. It'll flow through here, get constricted by the nozzle, and come out in high velocity hot gases. This is also used for a lot of maneuvering systems, and yeah, I mean, they're quite simple. Again, only one moving part really. You could have a valve here, but it's depending on the pressure of this tank, it's not needed. Although, if this is to operate in space, then yes, you will need it. Now, let's get on to the next part, which is a biprop pressure fed. Now, I briefly touched on this in our last video. I didn't call it by this name, but this is what it is. It's a bipropellant pressure fed. And the way this works is very similar. You can see it's kind of, if you took this part, you could copy paste it twice. The way this works, again, is you let go of these two valves. The pressure comes in here and here, and it pushes out the oxidizer. And yes, now we're using oxidizer. Although you can use hypergolic fuels. Basically what a hypergolic fuel is, when these two substances come in contact with each other, they spontaneously explode, or they combust. So either fuel and oxidizer can be used, or hypergolics can be used. And now we're using oxidizer and fuel because we want to access this internal energy. Same with the monoprop pressure tank, right? Or pressure fed. We're trying to access this internal energy from the chemicals. And combustion is a really good way of both increasing the pressure and accessing the energy stored inside of your propellants. So let's just say we're using oxidizer and fuel. It works the same with hypergolics. You have both the propellant and the oxidizer and the fuel come here, and as usual I didn't have space to draw it on this diagram, but there is an injector plate, and I can go over injectors in another video. They both mix. They mix in the combustion chamber. Right? And what comes out is you have hot gas, it gets constricted by the nozzle, and again comes out as hot, low pressure, high velocity gas. And that is how a bipropellant pressure fed engine works. This engine was used quite a lot, and a really good example is the space shuttle engine. Yeah. Now let's get on to a more new age engine. This is an electric pump fed engine. Again, I briefly touched on this in the last video. The way this works is very similar to this, except you'll have pressure flow in, although this pressure doesn't need to be at such a high pressure like these two, or these three, I guess. The pressure will flow in. It'll flow into both the fuel and oxidizer. Again, much lower pressure than these ones, so the tanks don't need to be as big, or as thick, so you can save weight. And the oxidizer will get pumped out of here as well as pushed from here by this battery operated pump. So you'll have high velocity oxidizer, high velocity fuel, and when they meet in the combustion chamber, they react, they combust, and again, hot gas comes out and it gets constricted in here. Now, the reason I say this is more new age is because this would not have been possible during the space race, because batteries recently have gotten a lot more power dense, but even still, this is just barely possible, right? The horsepower needed to spin these pumps at such a fast rate to compete with this high pressure is a massive amount of horsepower. So you need heavy motors and heavy batteries to do this. And it doesn't work like this where it'll get lighter as you use it, right? Batteries maintain the same mass even while there's charge in them. So this type of engine is extremely new age and is still being worked on. So I'm gonna flip the board and we'll talk about some more old age engines that are very efficient. I'll just leave this up here actually real quick if you want to take a picture or note anything down. All right. Now we're gonna turn the board around. And here we go. Okay. So this all probably looks pretty intimidating. It did for me the first time I saw it. So we'll walk it through pretty slowly. We're going to start off with the simplest one, the open cycle or gas generator engine. The way this works is we need to get the oxidizer and fuel out of the tanks, right? Now we'll have pressure in, coming through here, just a little bit of pressure in, just enough to push the fuel just a tiny bit, right? And the oxidizer actually. I don't know why I made that. All right, whatever. So out of the tanks, we have two pipes coming out of each of the tanks, and we'll have a tiny amount of. Sorry, I misdrew this. I just realized. This needs to be here. Okay. Sorry about that. You'll have a little bit of oxidizer come through the tank, and it'll come through this pipe down into here, and it'll go there. And this isn't all of the oxidizer, right? This is just a tiny, tiny amount. Same with the fuel. And this small amount here will combust, and you'll have hot gas. This will push on a turbine, right? And then we'll just dump the gas overboard, right? Because it's done all the work it can do. And, you know, we're running, because we're talking about space race aerotech, most of the time this was going to be RP1, right? And the way that we do this so that this turbine doesn't melt, right, because we're literally putting a turbine in the exhaust of a rocket engine, we need to run this extremely fuel rich, right? Because the more oxygen you put in the fire or in the flame, the higher temperature it's going to be. So we're going to run this fuel rich. Now the thing is, when you run it fuel rich, you introduce extremely sooty exhaust. So if you've ever seen a close-up of a rocket engine running and you've seen like black smoke pour out the side, that's what this is. It was a gas generator and it was pumping out this sooty exhaust out the side of it. Now this is really unfortunate though, because this exhaust has a lot of unburnt fuel in it. But relative to the amount of fuel that's going to be flowing into the combustion chamber, because now we have this massive pump assembly spinning up, right? Massive amount of oxidizer flowing in, and a massive amount of fuel also flowing into the combustion chamber. Relative to the amounts of fuel and oxidizer flowing into the combustion chamber, this is negligible. Well, not negligible, but it's acceptable. And again, you have oxygen and fuel in the combustion chamber. They're going to mix. They're going to ignite by some sort of light igniter. I didn't draw the igniter in these diagrams because we needed space. And it's going to react, and again, high velocity gas caused by the nozzle. All right. So, again, as I said, it's really unfortunate though that we have to throw this overboard, right? What we could do is, what if we didn't use RP1, right? What if we decided, what if we didn't run it RP1 rich, right? What if we ran it oxygen rich instead, right? Because we have to use, in this example, we have to use RP1 rich fuel because we needed it so that it wouldn't melt the turbine, right? Well, this is exactly what the Soviets did in the space age, or in the space race. And we had, and this is what's called an oxygen-rich stage combustion. And this is called an oxygen-rich stage combustion because we have pressure filling up the tanks the whole time the engine's running, just as usual. And this is just a tiny amount of pressure to get everything started. Now, what happens here is, you'll notice a small difference. On the oxygen tank in the oxygen-rich combustion engine, we have no oxygen, direct oxygen coming straight into the combustion chamber, right? So what happens is the oxygen will come through here, and it'll all of the oxygen in the entire tank comes into that right there, right? And in the fuel, again, we have two pipes coming out. Most of the fuel, most of the fuel is going to go directly into the combustion chamber, but just a tiny amount of fuel is going to come up through here, and this tiny amount of fuel is going to react with the oxygen, going to get ignited, and it's going to combust in here. Again, because of the nozzle, we're going to form high velocity gas. This high velocity gas is actually going to spin this turbine. This turbine spins, and this gets this oxidizer flowing through the system, gets the fuel going into the combustion generator. But we still have this exhaust from here, and because we're running it oxygen rich, what we do is we just take that exhaust and we put it in the combustion chamber as well. Now you have hot, oxygen rich gas and fuel inside of a combustion chamber. What's going to happen? They're going to combust, and you get high velocity, high temperature gas coming through the nozzle, which is exactly what we want. Now, as I said, the reason that we had to run this as fuel rich is because we didn't want the turbine to melt. The Soviets had actually found a way, or they made a metal alloy that was strong enough to survive this temperature. Now that's not a small feat because oxygen-rich combustion flames are actually extremely hot, and hot oxygen loves to react with basically everything that it can touch. So because they were able to get this alloy, they could stick with this design. Now, okay, we've seen an oxygen-rich stage combustion, so why can't we do a fuel-rich stage combustion, right? And again, as I said, because we're using RP1, so this will get sooty, and we can't put this sooty exhaust into the combustion chamber because it'll clog up the injectors, right? Because when you're burning carbons, right? So like you can think of your car exhaust, right? That exhaust is very sooty. And you can see it on like trucks, right? When they have the exhaust pipe going up, and you can literally see the black smoke. That is because it's very sooty exhaust because it still has a lot of unburnt fuel in it. That means the combustion wasn't fully done. So we can't really take that exhaust and put it in here because that exhaust is still, it's sooty, right? So it'll clog up everything that it can touch. And the injector holes need to be very small so that you can get really small droplets so that you get the most surface area, right? Talked about this last video. So we can't use the hydrocarbon fuel. What the US did is they were saying, okay, we're still gonna do a fuel. They couldn't get this alloy, right? They couldn't make this alloy. So they went through another direction because they didn't want to give up on they wanted to use this gas and pump it back in the combustion chamber, right? Because it's the next leap in efficiency. So they came up with this design. This design, the way it works is very similar to this one, but as you can see, it looks a little bit more complicated. And the reason is, this fuel here is methane. It is not methane because it has carbon. It is hydrogen, sorry. It is not methane. And this, again, as usual, we have pressurizer. We have pressurizing fluid. And the way this works is you have the fuel come out through here, and this fuel comes through this pipe and it gets separated. Half of it goes up to here, goes up there, half of it comes down through here, and it goes through there. Now the oxidizer, a large majority of it goes straight into the combustion chamber. But tiny amounts get taken and pulled up through here and down through here and end up in the combustion chamber and in these two combustion chambers. Now, the reason that we have two combustion chambers is because before this, the fuel and oxidizer were similar-ish density, right? You can use one pump to power them. You can use one speed of turbine to power them both. Problem is when you're using hydrogen, hydrogen is a very light molecule, or a very light element, and you need to use multiple stages to power it. Now in this diagram we don't have multiple stages, but I've separated it, just as it is done in the actual engines that use this type of combustion. So again, down here you'd have combustion. Whoa, why is this black now? Alright, sorry, I'm gonna have to use another color. You'll have this hot gas coming through here. This hot gas comes through here, spins this turbine, and then we take this exhaust gas, because this is just, essentially it's unburnt hydrogen that's very hot. And we're just gonna push it straight through here into the combustion chamber. A very similar thing here. And we're gonna take the exhaust, put it straight into the combustion chamber. And now, you have oxidizer and pre-burned fuel, right? And what pre-burned means is, this applies to this topic here as well. We're taking a large majority of one propellant and mixing it with a very tiny amount of the other propellant, right? So if you've ever done chemistry, right, and you've learned stoichiometry, you need like an equal amount, or you're not an equal, but you need the right ratio of the propellants to completely burn it. The problem is we're not giving it that type of good ratio, and what happens is you burn a little bit of it, right? You burn a little bit of in this one, you'll burn a little bit of the fuel, or you'll burn a little bit of the, because we're taking fuel, right? We're gonna put it up here, just a tiny amount of fuel, and a lot of oxidizer. You're gonna burn through all the fuel that's there, but you'll still have a lot of hot oxidizer. That's why we're able to pump it through here. In here, it's the exact opposite scenario. We're taking a lot of the fuel, right? We're literally splitting the entire fuel supply between these two pre-burners, and we're burning all the fuel and just taking a tiny amount of oxidizer and putting it into both. And then we're taking both of these outputs of the pre-burners, pushing them into the combustion chamber. And, oh yeah, I forgot that. They mix, and then the unburnt fuel and the oxidizer mix, and this combusts, and then you get hot, high velocity gas coming out the exhaust, which is exactly what we want. Now, this is all well and good. This is very efficient. You're using all of the energy that's there, right? But what if we didn't want to do that, and we decided to do two pre-burners, right? Same as usual as this one, but we wanted it so that all of the fuel goes to, or we don't want any of the pure, we don't want any of the pure gases coming into here, because again, if we think about this, right, this is going to be super cold oxidizer still coming in here, right? And if we come back here, this enthalpy, it takes energy, pressure, volume, right? This energy from the oxidizer, heat is also energy, right? So heat is, kinetic energy because particles are moving. We want all that energy. So this is very efficient, and so is this. Problem is, we still have very cold fluid in the combustion chamber, and that's not lowering the energy, but it's taking away from the energy we could have. What if we had hot oxidizer in here, or hot fuel? That would work. But even better, What if we had oxidizer-rich exhaust and fuel-rich exhaust in the combustion chamber? That would be the ideal scenario. And this is what's called a full flow stage combustion engine. That does exactly what I just described. So, I'm going to walk us through it again. We have pressure coming through the back, and this pushes out some of the oxidizer. The oxidizer comes up through here and gets split and also comes down through here. This is around, it's not a 50-50 ratio, right? Because we want oxygen-rich pre-burnt and we also want fuel-rich pre-burnt. So we'll take a lot of the oxygen, throw it up here, tiny amount of oxygen, put it down here. Same thing with the fuel. We'll have a little bit of the fuel come through. A lot of the fuel will go down this way into this pre-burner. A tiny amount of fuel will come through this way into this pre-burner here. Both of these pre-burners will ignite, hopefully at the same time. I forgot about this. This marker is bad. And they will ignite in the combustion chamber. Hot high velocity gas hits the turbine. Same thing down here. Hot high velocity gas hits this turbine. And this is going to be fuel rich pre-burnt exhaust coming through here. I'm just going to draw it like that. And I'll draw a little line of fuel just in case you want to take a screenshot. Right, that way you know it's fuel rich. Same thing here. This is exhaust plus oxidizer because it's still oxidizer rich up here. And now you have hot oxidizer and hot fuel mixing together in a combustion chamber that has an igniter in it. You ignite it, this all combusts, and it comes out super high velocity, very high temperature, very low pressure. And this is what is called a full flow stage combustion. This is called full flow because there's no little taking tiny bits of the fuel and throwing it around. You're just taking all of the fuel from the tank and throwing it straight in, right? And this works because, again, this is the way we could raise the enthalpy the most. And we want to raise enthalpy again because enthalpy is the potential to do work. Oh, sorry about that. And actually, real quick, I will also do this same thing that I did on this one on these two. So because this is going to be oxygen rich, I'll take oxygen and I'll draw it onto here so it's easier to see. Same thing over here. And over here. Now, remember, we can't use RP1 here. We can't use RP1 here. We can use RP1 here. And we can use RP1 here. What SpaceX is doing, this is what the Raptor engine uses, right? It's using this. SpaceX uses methane, and this works. This is one of the only full flow stage combustion engines built because it's kind of a beast to do. This diagram grossly oversimplifies it. All of these designs are much more complicated than what seems like on the board. And like this diagram is kind of the main concept. Like for this, because you're using hydrogen fuel, you need to have seals. You need to have leaking mechanisms where if it leaks, because then you'll have hydrogen leaking around the engine with oxidizer nearby, and you'll have an explosion. So that's not good. You need to have you need to have a lot of double checks in like all of these. None of these diagrams show that. Obviously this is because it's easier to draw and it's also way easier to explain. I can go over those type of safety mechanisms in another video if you want. Yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. I'll just leave this up for a little bit if you guys want to take a screenshot. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up the video. I will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave comments down in the description about what else you want to have videos about. If not, I will continue on with what I have planned. Thank you, and bye.